Presentations of intimacy, the relationship between extraversion and tendency to intimacy among counsellors. Hello, my name is Pip Hughes. I'm a student on the MSc in Counselling at Bangor University, talking today about my postgraduate research dissertation, Presentations of Intimacy, the relationship between extraversion and tendency to intimacy among counsellors. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Intimacy is a core component of the therapeutic relationship. Vulnerability, empathy, trust, closeness. These relational factors underlie strong alliances that lead to meaningful change and successful outcomes in therapy. However, the co-creation of these factors between counsellor and client may be impacted by their individual personalities and self-expression. Given the intimate and introspective nature of counselling, it may be reasonable to assume that individuals with a high tendency to intimacy are attracted to the counselling profession more so than those who are more fearful or avoidant of intimacy. Individuals with a higher frequency of intimacy behaviours and openness to intimacy have been seen to possess good self-awareness and genuine interest in others. Two key qualities of a good counsellor. An individual's relationship to intimacy has intrapersonal and interpersonal effects, and a significant underlying assumption of this study is that personality factors mediate these effects. Previous research has explored connections between intimate relationship satisfaction and different personality traits. High levels of extraversion have been seen to correlate positively with satisfaction in intimate relationships in multiple studies. Extraversion is a personality trait characterized by sociability, talkativeness, emotional openness, affection, and feeling energized in social situations and large groups. Extroverts also tend to be more emotionally expressive, open, and affiliative than their introvert counterparts, who tend to be more reserved and inward-focused. Suppression of emotional expressiveness has been linked to lower levels of extraversion. Extraversion has also been seen to correlate negatively with shame and positively with high levels of self-compassion. The existing literature paints a picture of extraversion as a protective characteristic, enhancing intimate relationships and creating optimal conditions to connect with others. Those with lower levels of extraversion appear to be more vulnerable to shame, introjection, isolation, and social withdrawal. This is not exclusive to clients and can also impact counsellors. High levels of perfectionism, which is often accompanied by underlying fear of judgment and low self-belief, is associated with lower levels of extraversion in counsellors. Differences in intimacy attitudes among counsellors, and tendency to intimacy in particular, may be related to differing levels of extraversion. Deeper understanding of how counsellors embody their attitudes to intimacy in the process of creating an intimate therapeutic relationship lies in understanding the relationships between tendency to intimacy and extraversion. This is where this study comes in. The study was primarily interested in the variation in intimacy attitudes and behaviours across two populations, counsellors and non-counsellors, as well as the relationship between tendency to intimacy and extraversion among counsellors. Two hypotheses were drawn from the existing literature that would connect intimacy attitudes and personality factors to the counselling context. The first hypothesis predicted that counsellors would demonstrate higher tendency to intimacy and more positive attitudes to intimacy than non-counsellors. The second hypothesis predicted that there would be a significant positive relationship between tendency to intimacy and extraversion among counsellors. Participants for the study were recruited in 5 ways. Through SONA, a system where participants recruited through the School of Human and Behaviour Science are rewarded with course credits for participation in research. Next, emails to counselling training providers, which were circulated among trainees, advertisements on the BACP notice board, social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, and lastly through word of mouth. Participants who wished to take part in the study were linked to an online Qualtrics questionnaire which explained the nature and purpose of the study in more depth. Participants were shown an information sheet which included all relevant information, including details regarding their data protection. Next, they were shown a consent form which was required to be signed in order for them to continue with the study. The consent form emphasized that they could withdraw at any time during the study up until the results had been published. Once participants had given their explicit consent, they were taken to the first part of the questionnaire, a short demographic survey which included questions about age, gender, and counsellor status. Then, participants answered 44 questions from the first measure, the Big Five personality test, a Likert scale questionnaire which asks participants to rank their agreement or disagreement with a particular statement, such as, I see myself as someone who is talkative. Next, participants answered 50 questions taken from the revised intimacy attitude scale, a similar Likert scale questionnaire to measure intimacy attitudes. Examples of statements include, I like to share my feelings with others, and I'm often anxious about my own acceptance in a close relationship. Participants were provided with a list of relevant support services to assist them with any distress caused. Contact details of external support organisations were included in the debrief form following questionnaire completion. The study aimed to test a sample of 150 participants, a mix of counsellors and non-counsellors. After excluding participants who did not complete the questionnaire or disclose their counsellor status, there were 170 participants total. 36 were trained or trainee counsellors, including counsellors who were qualified but not currently practising. 134 were non-counsellors and had never trained to be a counsellor or worked with clients. The first test, an independent samples t-test, aimed to identify differences in tendency to intimacy between counsellors and non-counsellors. The first key finding contradicted the hypothesis that counsellors would score higher in tendency to intimacy than non-counsellors. The non-counsellors had a higher mean score in tendency to intimacy than the counsellors in this sample. These findings challenge the underlying ideas that high tendency to intimacy attracts individuals to the counselling profession, and that counselling training fosters intimacy behaviours. However, there are some issues in making this generalisation, including an uneven balance between counsellor and non-counsellors in the sample, potentially resulting in reduced statistical power, and consideration of external personal factors influencing career path and accessibility of counselling training. It's possible that there are many individuals who are drawn to counselling as a career due to the emphasis on emotional intimacy, but do not have the resources to undertake training. Although the counsellor's tendency to intimacy was lower on average than non-counsellors, the standard deviation was also lower, meaning the data points were closer to the mean than non-counsellors. In other words, there was little deviation from the average seen in the counsellor sample. Non-counsellors showed more variability, while counsellors were more homogeneous in their tendency to intimacy scores. The second test, a correlation analysis, aimed to identify a statistically significant relationship between tendency to intimacy and extraversion among counsellors. The 36 counsellors in the sample scored highly on the extraversion subscale of the Big Five personality test, indicating that the counsellors perceived themselves to have extrovert qualities, although we don't know how or if they would label themselves explicitly as extroverts. There was no statistically significant relationship found between tendency to intimacy and extraversion among the counsellor sample. This tells us that the themes of emotional closeness, self-disclosure, and mutual dependence that characterize tendency to intimacy were not meaningfully connected to extraversion for this particular group. This counters a common finding running through the existing literature that links extraversion to emotional expressiveness and positive experiences in intimate relationships. It's also worth noting that when correlated, individual items from the tendency to intimacy subscale and the extraversion subscale, which included scores across both groups, showed statistically significant relationships, indicating a positive relationship between intimacy attitudes and extrovert qualities on the whole. The therapeutic relationship differs from other personal relationships in that it is a contracted, clearly boundaried relationship which is limited to a specific time and place. Intimacy is boundaried and contained, and its primary purpose is for the personal development of the client. While counsellors may self-disclose at appropriate times and model openness, honesty, and authenticity, sessions are centered on the client's frame of reference. This raises the question of whether attitudes towards personal intimate relationships are fairly comparable to professional therapeutic relationships, given the specific context. For example, when you think about what it means to be a good friend or partner in your personal life, Roger's core conditions of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard probably aren't the first thing that come to mind. The findings highlight this compelling division between personal intimacy attitudes and behaviors and the professional skill of co-creating intimacy in a therapeutic relationship. In addition, it raises questions about how high extrovert counsellors and low extrovert or introvert counsellors relate to intimacy and their role of co-creating intimacy in a professional counselling context. A key limitation of the study is the imbalance in the number of counsellor respondents compared to non-counsellor respondents. The small sample size of counsellor respondents could have led to reduced statistical power and made it difficult to detect any significant differences between the two populations, increasing the risk of a type 2 error, as well as making it difficult to generalize findings to the wider population of counsellors. The study also utilized a self-reported questionnaire as its method of data collection. This method has a number of limitations, such as interpretation bias, questions being interpreted differently than intended by the researchers. Response rate bias, as those who avoid or fear intimacy may be more unlikely to choose to respond to a questionnaire focusing on intimacy. Limited depth, as nuance and detail regarding intimacy attitudes cannot be captured by a Likert scale questionnaire. And also limited validity, as respondent honesty and accuracy cannot be controlled for. Future studies could alleviate these limitations by including a qualitative element, such as semi-structured interviews or focus groups, for increased depth and detail. However, these methods have their own unique limitations, such as social desirability bias, which may also be confounded by personality factors. Ultimately, this study aimed to offer a deeper understanding of the relationships that govern the therapeutic alliance, intimacy and personality. That the findings counteracted both hypotheses tell us that reality is always more complex than we might assume. It is hoped that the study prompts counsellors and non-counsellors alike to reflect on the way that their personality traits interact with their interpersonal intimacy attitudes for greater self-awareness and self-exploration. And it's hoped that this self-knowledge can enhance therapeutic practice and contribute to stronger therapeutic alliances. Thank you for listening.